Now, for more on this, we're joined by news correspondent at the United Nations headquarters in New York, Sherwin, Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, the Ukraine calling this moment historical. In fact, I think it had countries sign it for posterity. Tell us a little bit more about what took place today.
Historic, certainly, in terms of the level of consensus, Tsepiso, that was achieved. 141 members voting in favour of something at the UN General Assembly, given just what a divisive issue this was. You had the United States in one corner, you had Russia in the other end, and then you have the national priorities of individual states and their relationships with those two superpowers, really determining where they would vote here. And what you saw was an overwhelming consensus, 141 member states voting in favour of this resolution, essentially deploring the actions of Russia vis-a-vis its incursion into a UN member state and its violations of the UN Charter as it relates to territorial integrity, sovereignty of nations, independence, and so on. What was also interesting is just how this process unfolded, right? You had multiple meetings in the UN Security Council late into the night in terms of those emergency sessions. You then had Russia deploy its veto on Friday in a draft resolution that would have made, the condemnation legally binding. That failed. Then the Security Council met in another session on Sunday to refer this matter to the General Assembly for an emergency session. And we haven't had that kind of referral from the Security Council given the stalemate that was experienced there to the 193-member General Assembly to really call for what is now known as a emergency special session. This was the first time an emergency special session was held in the General Assembly since 1982, so 40 years. And so the lobbying was intense over the last number of days in terms of the European Union and the United States seeking to get a vast majority here that would increasingly isolate Russia on the international stage. And then, of course, you had pushback from Russia. But at the end, they only got 4 countries in support of their position, Tsepiso. Russia voted no, so did Belarus, the DPRK, Syria, and Eritrea. Countries with questionable human rights records. So certainly a victory from that perspective from the co-sponsors of this resolution. Some 95, countries co-sponsored the text, and so they will see this as an affirmation of their view and an affirmation certainly of the UN Charter. In addition to that, 35 abstentions, South Africa among them. And I thought it's best for us to play you South Africa's explanation of vote. Ambassador Matujoini took to the floor after that vote, trying to explain why South Africa abstained. This is what she said. Watch.
The resolution that we have considered today does not create an environment conducive for diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation. While we agree with and support the efforts taken by member states to bring to the attention of the international community the situation in Ukraine, South Africa feels that greater attention should have been paid to bringing the sides closer to dialogue. For South Africa, the text in its current form could drive a deeper wedge between the parties rather than contributing to a resolution of conflict. The resolution should have welcomed the commencement of negotiations between the parties. Additionally, the role of the Security Council, as well as the good offices of the UN Secretary General, could have been given more prominence in the resolution. It is understood that one of the root causes of conflict is related to the security concerns of the parties. This should have been addressed in the resolution. Even though this emergency special session of the General Assembly is being held after the failure of the Security Council to address the matter, we believe that the Security Council should still be urged to play its role as mandated by the Charter to maintain international peace and security. South Africa believes that the UN, especially in the context of emergency special sessions, whose nature and significance speak to the gravity of the issues we bring before the international community, should be used as a platform to build bridges, address the divergence of views, provide recommendation and support for the parties to engage with a spirit of compromise while de-escalating tensions.
Okay, so that is South Africa's explanation about trying to understand there why South Africa would abstain on this resolution. We also heard after the vote, Tsepiso, from the UN Secretary General. He took to the podium. He said, the General Assembly has spoken. As Secretary General, it's my duty to stand by this resolution and be guided by its call. The message of the General Assembly is loud and clear. End hostilities in Ukraine now. Silence the guns now. Open the door to dialogue and diplomacy now. So not exactly antithetical to the perspective and position of South Africa there, Tsepiso.
What was interesting, Sherwin, ahead of the vote, you had both Ukraine and Russia both quoting the UN Charter for the actions that they're taken. You mentioned the countries that abstained. You mentioned the countries that voted no. What is noticeable is that both India and China have now lost a citizen as a result of the tensions, the conflict, the war in the Ukraine. Do you think that this would sway countries' minds, their approach to this, the fact that it's not legally binding, that there are a growing number of casualties and the citizens of countries are in danger?
What this General Assembly resolution does, you talk about its the lack of its legally binding status, it really does provide a barometer, a temperature, a gauge of where member states of the United Nations fall on this. And what member states, I think by their vast majority said in this resolution is that they disagree with the notion that one country, a member state of the United Nations, can invade another country, even though that country might have legitimate security concerns. That's what we saw in terms of the 141 states that voted in favor of this. They are affirming the very central tenets, the very central pillars of the United Nations Charter, and there's no equivocation around that, right? There's no debate around that. It's very clear that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a member state shall be respected by all other member states, no less a permanent 5-member, a veto-wielding member of the UN Security Council. The only reason this process went to the General Assembly was because the Security Council itself was incapable of taking a decision on this matter because of the rules that govern the Security Council. 5 permanent members based on who won, who were the victors after World War II. They have the most power in the Security Council. So one has to question, South Africa's call also for a greater role here for the UN Security Council. The argument, certainly from people that know how this council works, is that they've done pretty much everything they can do based on the fact that you have a P5 member with a veto that is also the protagonist it's the aggressor in this conflict. So it's a very complex situation, and that's why you also heard from Matu Johini speaking yesterday in the General Assembly, saying that this issue really needs to emphasize the need for Security Council reform. Intergovernmental negotiations have, of course, been ongoing for a number of years, and they are not moving, to a resolution anytime soon, Tsepiso. Why? Because the 5 permanent members of the Security Council must vote to affirm any decision that is made by the general membership. So they have the final say on any reform process. And so that is the contradiction that we face here. So the temperature that this resolution gives us is really very much a gauge of where the world stands, and the world has, by an overwhelming majority, repudiated Russia's position here. Only 4 countries with questionable human rights records voted with Russia. That's not something you want to put in the bank and take home with you.
Now, all of this occurs as President Joe Biden gives his State of the Union address, his first, and drawing rare bipartisan praise, particularly on his statements on the Ukraine. But does everybody believe that he's done enough? Do the American people believe that America's foreign policy is taking precedent where it shouldn't?
Yeah, it's a great question about whether there is broad consensus in the United States in support of the position that the United States has taken, and certainly what Western nations have taken here. I don't think there is an appetite for military incursion or intervention by the United States, given that it has just withdrawn from the longest running conflict in the history of the United States, from Afghanistan. And you saw the fallout from that and the chaotic nature of that withdrawal. There is no appetite for the United States to get into a prolonged, protracted conflict, no less with a fellow adversary that is a nuclear-armed state. It has, Russia has the most number of nuclear weapons in the world. So that sort of confrontation is something completely antithetical to anything that the United Nations would like to see, particularly in the context, Sepiso, of how the world is seeking to build back better from an economic pandemic, a COVID-19 pandemic that has decimated economies and developmental states. So the focus really now has to be on the economic pressure. And what you saw, I think, for the first time in a long time, was bipartisan support. Members from both sides of the aisle standing up in that joint sitting at the State of the Union last night to affirm the president's view. And he spoke very forcefully about the fact that they will hold Russia to account and that President Putin would pay a price. And so it was very unique in a sense, certainly within the last decade, to observe the bipartisan nature of the support. Look, there's also some people in the United States who feel, well, the United States perhaps should intervene militarily, but I think that is a minority view in this country, particularly given the last 6 to 8 months, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. There is no real appetite for the United States to be militarily involved, particularly when the threat is not directly to the United States in this instance.
So, Sherwin, President Biden's pro-democracy speech underscored the international upheaval, but he also focused on the impact back home, how sanctions on Russia could affect gas prices, but the hardships already faced by Americans. What did he propose on building better, but also making life better for the scores of people who are still unemployed or earning very low wages?
Yeah, he also, nodded his hat to the fact that he appreciates the fact that given supply chain constraints as a result of manufacturing capacity coming back post the pandemic, the fact that so many Americans are grappling with rising prices. Inflation is at records not seen since the early 1980s. So given the acute nature of the economic challenges that face the United States, I think bolsters the argument why the U.S. does not want to get involved militarily in this Ukraine battle with Russia. But of course, as State of the Unions go, Tsepi, so the focus is essentially on what is local, on what is national, on the local audience here, and a great deal of emphasis on the fact that he was going to prioritize bringing down inflation. He also talked about a coalition of some 30 countries that would be releasing about 60 million barrels of oil reserves in order to temper the rising fuel prices. But despite all those efforts, it's not within the remit or the control necessarily of the United States president. There was an acknowledgement from him that given the nature of how interconnected the world is, right, particularly from an economic point of view, that placing sanctions and punitive measures on Moscow is going to have a ripple effect, particularly as it pertains to gas and oil prices. And there, in addition to that, there is also a domestic agenda in terms of this Build Back Better program that the president has put forward, and really seeking to build consensus around things like childcare and paying for increasing wages and that sort of thing. That is a big focus on the domestic agenda, certainly for this president, but he's going to need both parties to come to the table. The Senate is a 50-50 split. He also talked about the confirmation process of his Supreme Court nominee that will replace one of the longest-serving associate justices. So there's a lot of consensus that the president needs to seek to build, certainly in the days and weeks ahead.
And all of this, Sherwin, at a weakened political position toward midterms. We spoke about that, as you mentioned, bipartisan infrastructure law. He mentioned gun laws as well, the new COVID-19 strategy that I believe is expected. How much of that will be able to buy back the Democrats' support?
We're in an election year. Don't forget, Pisa, we have midterm elections in November. And so when we talk about this, consensus that is necessary for any legislation to pass, both the House and the United States Senate, don't forget that there are political dynamics at play here as well, and control of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And that could impugn, and that could certainly create new obstacles for the remaining 2 years of President Biden's first term in office. And so consensus building is one thing, but you're also in an election year, and that those political dynamics, particularly as it relates to who will control the legislative arms of government, is certainly going to be something that we have to factor in here.
Sherwin, thank you very much. And of course, we'll continue that conversation with you. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, correspondent at the United Nations.